Okay, so I do have Chroma Lux open on my screen, but if you have Chroma Inspire or Chroma Plus, everything that I'm talking about will be the same. So all of the settings here that I'm going to be working with, they will apply depending, even if you have Chroma Inspire. So I'm just going to use Lux just as my my own program here, but again, this is for all tiers of Chroma. Okay, so a couple of the topics that I mentioned that we're going to discuss is going to be density, underlays, changing styles, and then we're also going to talk about sequencing, because that also matters when we're digitizing for different fabrics, or in this case, garments. Okay, so these are the main topics that we're going to talk about today. And the first being density. So when we're talking about density, that is referring to how close the stitches are to each other. So if we look at a satin column, or if we look at a complex fill shape, then we are also going to take a look at the density. So when we're figuring out what density to choose, and that means, you know, how close our stitches are to each other. So a higher number, like a density of 1 millimeter, means those stitches are going to be 1 millimeter apart. So they're going to be very far apart. So I'll show you that here. I typed in 1 in my density box in the right-hand corner, and you can see that they're very, very far apart. So the higher the number, the more spaced out those stitches are. And the lower the number, so if we do a 0.3 density, then those stitches are closer together and there's only 0.3 millimeters of space in between each thread or each stitch. So you can have density on any different stitch type except for a run stitch, because a run stitch is just a single line. So a density will not apply to a run stitch. But we have a satin, we have a complex fill. So when we're considering the fabric that we're going to put our design on, we need to make sure that we're taking that into consideration when we choose the density. If I'm working with a very lightweight, thin fabric, such as a silk, I don't want to have a very dense design on that lightweight fabric. It will pull on the fabric, it will bunch up, you'll have puckering. So I don't want to have a huge complex fill shape that has a really low density if my fabric is very lightweight and can't hold that number of stitches. So as our density goes down, our stitch count is going to increase. And we can talk about these two items together, the stitch count as well as the density, so they are directly related. So lightweight fabrics, I don't want a low density. I would want to loosen that up, and that way the lightweight fabric can better hold that amount of stitches. So we always want to have the proper amount of backing as well, but we're not going to discuss backing because that doesn't really pertain to digitizing. So just keep that in mind. That's more so when we're talking about the actual embroidery machine and hooping. So lightweight fabrics, silk, satin, those delicate pieces, or let's say we're doing something that is a very lightweight jersey t-shirt. It's very thin. We don't want to have a very thick, dense letter on that piece of material. So increasing that number, having your density be a little bit higher, like a 0.4, is going to work better on something that's super lightweight. Okay, so our density definitely matters. We want to make sure that we're keeping that in mind, not just looking at it on the screen, but thinking about what we're putting our design on. Okay, so if we talk about, say, text, and we're putting some text on a lightweight shirt, then I might have the density at a 0.3 or 0.4 versus if we're putting a 3D puff text on a canvas hat, then of course I can have something be a lot more dense and tight in the stitches. Okay, and so we can see that on screen as well. You can have a visual of the difference. I have a higher density on the left and a lower number on the right. Okay, so density is something we want to consider. Now let's talk about underlays. And I'm going to open up a new tab because our underlay is really going to help out with difficult fabrics. And so we can talk about fabrics such as towels. We can talk about fabrics like fleece. So if we're doing something that's very fluffy, or if we're doing something that's knit, like a knit shirt or knit sweater. So with towels or any fabric that has a high pile, a fleece even, it does have a high pile. And what that means is the fabric isn't flat and smooth. A towel obviously has small loops, like a terry cloth. So with our digitizing, we don't want our stitches to get lost in those small loops on our towel. So for a towel specifically, we can do quite a few different things, such as we can, of course, change the density, the underlay, but we can also create a nap blocker. And this is something that you can do on even a fleece or a fluffy material like the holidays just passed. If we're doing something on a fur stocking, then we would want to add a nap blocker. So we have a video that shows how to make a nap blocker in both Inspire and Plus and Luxe. In Luxe, we have a very quick tool that's found in the utility feature, and we can see here that it says create nap blocker. And what that looks like is it looks like a very, very loose complex fill or loose running stitch that is going to cover the area of our text. So this is something that will be placed behind the letters, and then on our text, we'll have that show up on top. And the purpose of the nap blocker is to flatten out any fluffy material to create a nice smooth base. So towels, fleece, anything like a terry cloth or a furry fabric, we can create a nap blocker. You can even do a nap blocker on something that is like a cable knit or a rib knit, because those fabrics have a texture and we want to provide the most even base for our stitches to adhere to. So nap blocker is a great feature or function. And if you have Inspire, you can sort of create your own nap blocker just by creating a really loose shape around your text and then converting it into a very open, open density shape. So I have this complex fill that I just created, and if I increase that density quite a bit, you can see that it will give me the same sort of effect, and I can just remove an underlay to get the same sort of look. And we can always change the stitch direction to really duplicate or replicate the nap blocker that I created with Chroma Luxe. Okay, so you can create the nap blocker with any of the tiers. You're just doing it manually if you have Inspire, or you can do it with that one-click function with Luxe. Our underlay is also going to help out with any fluffy material, anything that has texture or anything that is fluffy like a fleece. So think of a fleece jacket. We have a nice soft fluffy material, and with anything like this, we don't want our stitches to sink in and get lost. We don't want to lose any of that detail. So with our underlay, we have quite a few different options, and your Chroma program will set the underlay for you. So we're looking at our upper right-hand settings boxes. And the underlay is here, and I can see that I have about 8 different options. So let's take a look at the differences, and I'll discuss which one is going to be best for our fluffier fabrics. So right now with my text, I have a center line. So that just means that the underlay is going to run down the center of the letter. A contour, if we go to the top, a contour underlay will move around the contour or the outline of the letter. So you can see that the underlay, which we're looking at just underneath those top satin stitches, is running along the contour of the letter. So it's sort of giving like a nice trace or shape of the letter before we have our satin stitch go down. A parallel is going to look like a zigzag, and you can even see a little preview in that underlay settings box. So it really gives you a nice preview here. A parallel underlay looks like a little zigzag, and those underlay stitches, they run parallel to the top stitches. Perpendicular is going to be, this is mostly for a complex fill. If we're trying to use a perpendicular underlay on some satin stitches, it will resemble just a center line because the underlay is going to run perpendicular to the top stitches. So if we look at the preview in that settings box, this is really a underlay for a complex fill stitch type, not quite a satin, but you can still see that preview there. Zigzag is going to resemble a parallel underlay, but it is a double zigzag. And a double zigzag is going to help for textured fabrics. So if we are going to stitch out on our towel, even if we create a nap blocker, we can still create, or we can still add a zigzag underlay, and that's just going to further help create a nice flat base for our top stitches. So the purpose of an underlay is to create a flat base, so create sort of a barrier for those top stitches. The underlay will also help to tack your backing to your top fabric, so it does help to secure those two sheets together. And it's going to just provide a nice base. So it helps to keep those top stitches anchored. So for a towel, for a fleece, for any textured knit, a double zigzag is going to be a great underlay to use. And you can see that it has that just extra stitches there. The other underlays that we have, the lattice, full lattice, and edge travel, are for our complex fill stitches. So if we take a look at this shape here, I'll change it back to, say, a standard complex fill. And let's take a look at our fill underlays. So a lattice is going to run sort of diagonally to your stitches. And this is something that's very common in a complex fill. This, again, provides a nice base for our stitches to adhere to. So this is going to secure our backing to our fabric. It's going to lay down the initial stitches so that our top stitches can run nice and smooth on the fabric. So a lattice will be very common with a complex fill. If we look at a full lattice, that's just double a lattice. So if we're putting something like a complex fill onto a towel, we can do a full lattice, and that will help to smush down that pile of the towel. So when I'm referring to the pile, that's the small loops. You can also, if you're picturing a carpet, you have a low pile or high pile carpet, and that's referring to the length of the small loops. So full lattice will help with towels, anything very textured. Maybe you want to stitch something on a corduroy fabric. A corduroy has very deep ridges in it. So if you're putting a little design, let's say you're putting some stars onto a corduroy jacket, then on this star, I will probably want to add some extra underlay, and I can do a full lattice, and we can even double underlay. So I could even add full lattice plus the perpendicular, which is the default. So we'll zoom in here, and you can see that that's just quite a lot of stitches. So full lattice, though, will really help flatten that material. The last underlay that we have is our edge travel, and that's going to be more so just, if we look at this, something that looks like no underlay, pretty much. So the program will sort of just start. I'm going to send this to the back, and we'll see how it stitches out. So you can see it just goes in the direction that I have the stitches. So that's going to be similar to having no underlay. Edge travel. If we look at a satin, so same thing. It's just the machine will start up the stitch and just run the stitches. So I don't have any questions so far, so I'm just going to keep going. And hopefully you guys are just taking some notes. I don't recommend to try and duplicate what I'm doing. So just watch along and jot down some notes and chat in any questions you have in the chat box. So we had a little overview of density, little overview of our underlays. Now I want to show you something that is built into Chroma, and it's something called changing the style. So changing the style is going to help us to decide upon the density, the underlay, and even the pole compensation. What pole compensation is referring to is we have our letters here, And this is a satin stitch. When we stitch something on a material, especially if it has a little bit of stretch or if it's more lightweight, any sweatshirt material or knit fabric or just regular t-shirt even, when we stitch on that fabric, we will sometimes notice that the letters or the column is going to appear a lot thinner. So if we have this satin column and I stitch this out on a peak polo shirt, it might end up looking more like this size where it's actually a lot thinner, because the reason why we have this problem or issue is because the stitches are going to pull on the fabric. You have more pull on something that's lighter weight or has any stretch or give to it. If you're stitching something on a very, very stiff fabric, a very stiff structured hat, you're not going to see as much pulling because that fabric doesn't have as much give or stretch in it. So when we're talking about pull compensation, we're going to compensate for the fabric pulling. This is a setting that you have in your upper right-hand corner settings boxes, so all of these settings tabs, and you can set the compensation in a percentage or an absolute value. So let's just go through the basics of this. If we choose percentage, if we enter in, say, 130%, that means that this stitch, this column, the needle is going to overextend past the outline about 30%. And so that's going to give us some extra width in the satin column to account for the pulling of the material. Oops. Okay, so you can see that in the beginning I resized the bottom column to be much thinner, but I added pull compensation, and they're now the same width. We can do this with letters. If I'm putting this text on a very lightweight shirt, or maybe we're doing very small text, we can add in some pull compensation, and when we apply that, we'll see that our letters appear a little bit thicker on screen. And when we go to stitch it out, that extra compensation will sort of reduce back, and we'll see the correct width that we wanted. Okay, so I have some questions that I wanted to answer. One question was about the underlay, and the question says, doesn't the underlay add to the weight of the design? So shouldn't you use only the minimum underlay that will help your design? Yes, of course. So the underlay does add to the weight, of course. Now, we don't want a complex fill shape with a double lattice underlay on a lightweight fabric. We probably don't need that anyway. So when we're talking about adding additional underlay, though, that's for our fabrics that have texture or high pile, and a towel or a fleece can stand up to that extra underlay. We're not putting an extra underlay on a very lightweight jersey shirt or a silk or a satin. So these extra underlays where the machine is adding additional stitches, those are for those high pile or textured fabrics. Or the star, if like I said, we're putting this on a pair of corduroy pants or a jacket, that material, that can hold those extra stitches. So that's going to be something that will be able to stand the extra weight or the extra stitches there. So if we're talking about a lightweight fabric, we're not adding in additional underlay, we're just making sure we choose the proper underlay. So for letters, a parallel or a zigzag, it's adding in a little extra, but we are also going to ensure that the density of the top stitches isn't too low. So let's take that question and go into more in-depth talking about, let's say, knit fabrics, right? So if we envision a lightweight knit t-shirt, then what we would want to do is we do want to provide a nice sturdy base for the stitches so that they don't end up sinking into the material, getting lost, or pulling too much where our letters end up looking irregular, choppy, or have like a zigzag outline. So for a knit, we can do an underlay of zigzag. That's providing a nice barrier or base to the fabric. And if we look at this object or text, it has 340 stitches with our zigzag underlay. And if I just take off the underlay, it's 270 as an average. So the stitch count, it is increasing, but not by a lot. And we're not adding in a ton of density. So we're not creating this in a density of 0.2 or 0.3. We would keep it kind of loose, and depends on the size as well.
Alex, you got it. Thank you.
So I had another question that was explaining how to determine when you need to use the pull compensation. So think about the fabric. If you are comparing fabrics and you have a sweatshirt, although it might be a little bit thicker, so like a nice hoodie or crew neck sweatshirt, a sweatshirt, it usually has some stretch, and you'll find that you'll see a little bit of sinking in. So your text or your stitches, whether it's, mostly we're talking about pull compensation with satin most of the time, although we can still have some pulling on a complex fill, which is this blue object. With a sweatshirt, we're going to have the stitches be able to pull on that fabric. So if you think about threading a needle, putting a needle into the fabric, how much will that fabric be able to be pulled tight? So a sweatshirt, we do want to add pull compensation. We want to add maybe like an extra 20%. So adding in percentage of 120 or even 125. If we put the same text on a stiff hat, if you were to put a needle into the hat and try to pull on the fabric, you probably will not be able to pull that fabric tight. So a sweatshirt, you can pull it, and a canvas structured hat, you cannot. So that's kind of the best way to determine if you need to add in pull compensation, is how much that material is able to be like pulled or smushed, or how, I guess, malleable it could be, is a good way of sort of explaining it. You can always add in a little bit of pull compensation, and the worst that would happen is your letters end up looking a little bit more bold than you initially envisioned. So if we're adding in a lot of pull compensation on a stiff fabric, then our stitches are just going to overextend past the outline, and we'll have something that looks thicker, like we bolded the text. So when we're adding in some pull compensation, we can think about fabrics like our peak polos. So that's your standard polo shirt where it has a little bit of texture to it, maybe a little stretch. Our sweatshirts, our athletic shirts, a polyester shirt that has a little bit of spandex or nylon, those polyester athletic or dry fit shirts, we definitely want to add in some pull compensation. Anything that that has stretch, definitely, and anything that might be more plushy. So even with our fleece, we can probably add a little bit there. Now, this is all a lot of information because we talked about density, we talked about underlay, we talked about the pull compensation, we talked about even creating a nap blocker. Now, the one thing that I wanted to discuss, the reason why I have knit here 3 times, is we have the ability to change the style, which is also referring to the fabric, in the Chroma program. So with Chroma Luxe, we have this option in our right-click function. And I'll show you the other way if we're using Inspire. So in Chroma Luxe, I have knit here 3 times. I'm going to, on the top, right-click, go into Utility, and we'll see we have Change Style. When I click there, I have a drop-down of a couple different fabric styles. So canvas, all the way to a woven, we have vinyl even, we have velvet, so, and we can even see towel. So let's make the first one, we're actually going to choose t-shirt, okay? So we have t-shirt. You can see right off the bat, if I go back, how that changed it. It's going to thicken up quite a bit. So I have normal, then I have t-shirt. So between the normal one, which is purple, and the t-shirt, which is the pink, let's take a look at the differences. So the first one that I have just set to normal, this is, if we look at the fill, we have a 0.4 density. If we look at the underlay, it has a center line. And if we look at the push-pull compensation, I believe I had changed this to 130. If we look at the other one for the t-shirt, we do actually still have some pull compensation. However, it's set to absolute. So that means 0.4 extra millimeter over the edge. So it's a lot thicker. If we look at the underlay, it does have a parallel. And if we look at the fill, we're at a 0.45. So that's nearing, it's higher, right? When we change the style, if I have this third knit where it's green, and I go in and change the style to a towel, then it's going to, again, change my settings to account for that type of material. So it will set your density, it will set your underlay. We're at a zigzag, right? That's that double zigzag. We look at the push-pull compensation, so still at 0.4. And those settings you can easily change just by changing the style. So if we are going to do something on jeans, that's going to have a much different pull compensation. We have a lot less, which makes sense. The underlay is back to a parallel, and the fill is actually at a 0.5. Okay, so these different styles, you can play with them and you can even see what changes between them. And that will also help you to determine what settings you might want to change when you're just digitizing something yourself. So through changing the style here, you can take a look at those settings and you can kind of jot down some notes and see what the program is choosing for what material type. Okay, so the default, which is normal, so we keep going back. I'm just going right click, utility. So normal is just going to, that's going to be for just kind of like your average material. So normal, it'll set the underlay. It probably won't add in any pull compensation for you. The density will be set to the default within Chroma. So normal is just your standard. If we're using Chroma Inspire, so if you have like the basic package, you can still change your style. You just have to do that before you begin digitizing. So I have a new page here and I'm going to go into my tools, into general options. So this is a great tab to kind of take a look at. And right on the front page, underneath the units, we have default style. And so I can change my default. If I know I'm going to be doing a lot of canvas hats or canvas jackets, some stiff materials, maybe I'm making patches on a canvas as my base, then I'm going to set my default style to canvas. And that way, when I go to start digitizing whatever I need, it's going to set the underlay, density, and etc. for canvas. So what we have here is we have, this is an edge, a contour underlay. So this runs along the edge of those stitches, providing like a base or a barrier, and these edge run, or the contour I mean, but it's running along the edge, is providing an anchor point for those stitches. So we don't need a lot of flattening out in the center because our canvas material is usually going to be just pretty stiff, doesn't have any texture or pile to it. So we don't need something in the center, but we do need a nice anchor point. So that contour underlay is set there for you. Okay. So if, let's say I want to go back and we're actually going to start doing something on, let's do a sweatshirt. I can go back, tools, general options, I can change to sweatshirt, and now when I'm creating my design, it will set the default settings for a sweatshirt. So you can switch back and forth, of course, and it's just found in a different area, that's all. With Chroma Inspire and Plus as well, you're just going to find that in the tools, general options. And with Lux, you just happen to have it here in your utility. So Joan asks, is doing a stitch out is necessary to see what is really going to happen? Yes, when we're looking at our designs on screen, that really doesn't mean that it's going to stitch out exactly like that on your garment, because we do have a lot of other factors that are coming into play. So when I'm looking at something here, but I'm going to stitch it out on a lightweight jersey fabric and I don't use any backing and I don't hoop it correctly, of course, it's not going to stitch out like it looks here. Whenever you're doing a test, we always say that you can test your designs on 2 sheets of cutaway backing. That, of course, always works, but if you're able to test on the same fabric, that will give you a much better representation of how that design stitches. So I believe customer recommended go to a thrift store, buy a bunch of shirts, you know, a woven button-down shirt, a soft t-shirt, buy a canvas jacket. You can buy all these different fabrics to be able to test your design on the same fabric. Okay, I don't want to test this on a lightweight piece of backing if I'm actually going to put it on a stiff piece of leather. I'll have a different result, most likely. So, but yeah, always testing and always trying to test using the same type of fabric is going to be best and it will be most accurate. So keep asking questions. We still have some time. What I want to talk about next, which is sequencing. So we're talking about digitizing for different fabrics, but we also want to consider the type of garment as well. So let's just go through like 2 very different types of garments. Let's go through a hat, and then let's talk about a large sweatshirt. So if we have a large sweatshirt and we're putting a very large, I'm just going to do this as an example, but let's say we have a large design on the back of a sweatshirt. Now, if I have this design start from the top corner and move all the way down to the right, we might have a lot of pulling or pushing, and we can end up with having something very warped. So when you do have something that is very large, and again, this big box is just an example, we probably would not stitch out this that large, but try to have the design sequence from the middle going like outwards, and that way you won't have one side pushed all the way on the other. And we can also relate this to a hat as well. And we're doing something on a hat. We don't want our design to start stitching from the left and go all the way to the right. We'll have the machine end up pushing on the hat fabric, and we'll have puckering in the middle or on the right-hand side. So sequencing your files are definitely helpful for the type of item. So it's not really in reference to the fabric so much, but I did want to just touch on that, and we can, use that tip. So anything like super large, middle going outwards is helpful, and same thing for a hat is middle going out to each side and then bottom up. Okay, so middle out, bottom up for our different items. If we go more advanced, we can also talk about stitch length. So let's use a letter as an example. and let's change the underlay. So let's say we're going to keep it at just a parallel underlay, just a standard common underlay for a t-shirt maybe, or a hat. We can do a parallel underlay. We also have the stitch length that we can play with in the underlay tab. So we can change the density as well. And if we look at this letter here, it's a pretty large letter, so it's about 500 stitches. We can actually change the density of the underlay, and now the underlay is a lot closer to each other, those stitches, and I did increase it by about 75 stitches. So it's not horrible, but we're adding in a little bit extra underneath. So we can change the underlay of the density of the underlay. And going back to the question that was from Joan, actually, she mentioned that the underlay does add in stitches. And sometimes with different fabrics, we don't want our stitch count to be very high because it can be very dense and thick and kind of pull down too much on the material. So I just changed this density from 2 to 3, and it eliminated a couple of stitches there. So that might be something you can play with as well. So I know there's a lot of factors, a lot of things to adjust, but this area here, I'm just going to go through it. It's a little bit more advanced. If you're just starting out, I would leave them as your default, but we have density, stitch length, and then run stitch length. So the stitch length is referring to how long the needle is going to jump before puncturing the fabric. So let's say we're changing our stitch length from 1 to 4, then the machine, instead of every 1 millimeter jumps, it's going to jump every 4. So you have less punctures in the fabric. With softer fabrics, if our stitch length is very low, then that underlay might end up getting lost. So if we look at the best way for me to explain a little bit better is we have this run stitch. And if you look very closely, we have little tiny dots in that line. So I have a dot here, have a dot here, here. So those little dots are 3 millimeters apart. If they were very close together, 1 millimeter, then those little stitches, they might actually sink into my fabric because the needle's puncturing, so the short stitch will end up getting lost. So sometimes you can actually increase that stitch length, and that way we have a 5 millimeter length of thread that's going to sit on top of our fabric. And that's just an extreme example, but you can play with that actually with your underlay. So you can see the run stitch length is referring to that underlay stitch. Okay. Small lettering, which if you tuned into the last Facebook Live, we actually discussed small lettering on a hat. For small lettering, a center line is usually a great underlay because we won't have this underlay risk popping out from our top thread. Now sometimes we want a contour, so that way it's laying a nice base down on our fabric. And with our contour, we could play with the inset. So if we were playing with the inset, we can really have it be like moved in a lot further from the edge than right up close to the edge. So right here, it's only inset about 0.2 millimeters from the edge of the letter, and we'll have a higher risk of this underlay sticking out from underneath. If I change the inset to something higher, then we'll see the underlay scooches in a lot closer to the center. So that's something that we can play with in our underlay. Okay, so the inset, again, is a factor that you can adjust. So you have a lot of ability to play with underlay, density, styles, stitch length, and again, going back to our little cheat of changing the style, that is a really great way to see what Chroma is deciding for you on different materials. So if I'm not quite sure what to do on a velvet, let me just select velvet, and then I can see, all right, it shows, you know, the density is a 0.37, and my underlay is parallel, and the pole comp is set to 0.3. So I can kind of take note of those settings, and on something that might be similar to velvet, then I can choose those settings. Okay, so I know it was a lot of information. Hopefully you guys took away some tips and wrote down some notes. And this was recorded, so of course, if you want to request the recording, please send us an email to service@ricoma.com and put in the subject line January 13 webinar. And that way we can send you the download link for this meeting, and you can be able to watch this over again and be able to just take in all of the information, continue jotting down some notes, and really try out different underlays and densities with different fabrics. Again, I would recommend buying a bunch of different fabrics and just do a lot of testing and see what works best, because that's really the only way to get a perfect result, is you're doing a lot of trial and error. There are so many factors that go into this, into digitizing and stitching out properly. So it's hard to have just one cheat sheet of what density, what underlay, because we do need to consider the design and the fabric and what the size is and everything like that. But keep practicing. As always, you can email us with any questions, and just send over email to service@ricoma.com for the recording of this webinar. All right, thank you guys so much. Appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.